I'm Melissa Grycan, restoration ecologist with the Land Conservancy of McHenry County, a non-governmental, not-for-profit land trust that preserves and restores land in northern Illinois. Today I'll be taking you on a virtual tree and shrub identification hike. Most of the places I'm filming today will be at Hennen Conservation Area, a 28-acre park that's open to the public on the south side of Woodstock. So you all can watch this video and then come on out to Hennen to practice what you've learned. For this video, we'll be covering most of the common native species found in our natural areas in the region. We'll also be covering some of the problematic invasive species that invade and degrade these areas. What we won't be covering is a lot of the non-native trees that are typically found in landscaping or arboretums or along city streets, unless they're one of those problematic invasive species. We also won't be covering every single tree that is native to our region because we simply don't have time for that. The purpose of this video is more for you all just to start getting familiar with what to look at when identifying trees for yourself. For time reasons, we've split this video up into two main categories. So this first part will be covering all of the trees in our region, and the second part will be covering the shrubs. We have just a little bit of vocabulary to take care of first, mainly based on leaf shape and structure. One main category when describing the shape of a leaf is to tell whether you have a simple leaf or a compound leaf. A simple leaf, found on many trees such as cherries, maples, oaks, it means that there's one leaf attached to a stem which is attached to a main branch. A compound leaf, found on trees such as ash, walnut, or hickories, will have many leaflets attached to a stem, attached to the main branch of the tree. One way to tell the difference, whether you're looking at a simple or compound leaf, is that the leaf is actually, since this is all one major thing, it's not going to want to fall apart at the individual axils. It's going to want to fall apart right where the leaf actually meets the stem. So if you pull on these individual leaflets, they're rather hard to get off, versus if you try snapping it off of the main branch, it breaks right apart. Otherwise, you can zoom in. There's actually little leaf buds every time a leaf meets a stem, so you could look for those as well. In our region, there are two main types of compound leaflets. These each have their own name as well. This one is a Pinnately compound leaf that is a more linear structure. You can see the leaflets coming off each side, and then usually a terminal leaf up above coming out of the tip. Or there is a palmately compound leaf, which kind of looks like the palm of your splayed hand. Another category of leaf shape is whether you have entire leaves or lobed leaves. So entire just means that you have a whole entire leaf. There's no little cutouts or lobes. And typically leaves are shaped kind of in that football shape that is called elliptic. Otherwise, as with our maples, you can have a palmately lobed leaf. Palmately, once again, being like the splayed fingers of your palm. Or like our oaks, you can have a pinnately lobed leaf with the lobes kind of emanating off of that central stem. And our final note on leaf shape, we want to be looking at the edges of the leaves. They can be serrate or sometimes even doubly serrate. So serrate just means like a serrated knife. There's teeth on the edge of the leaf. And then in this case on our birches, you can see that it's doubly serrate, so the teeth have teeth. For this video, we'll break things down into groups based on whether they're trees or shrubs, have opposite or alternate branching, and whether they have simple or compound leaves. We'll start with the trees, and for the first group, we'll cover trees that have opposite branching and have simple leaves. Around here, there's really only one group of trees that follow that pattern, and that's the maples. In our natural areas around here, we typically have sugar maples, Norway maples, and silver maples. Silver maple is the easiest to tell apart between the three of those. Silver maple has historically grown in floodplains and along river edges, but they will start moving up into prairies and woodlands if they're not kept in check by something like a prescribed burn. These trees have skinnier leaves than the Norway or the sugar maple, and they kind of have a really sharp appearance and very angular, deeply lobed leaves. The bark of silver maple consists of flat plates with some furrowing in between. Moving on to sugar maples, they're not actually super common in the county, but they can be found in some areas, like in our moist, high-quality woodlands. And Norway maple is found in basically any woodland around the county that's close to somewhere where Norway maples have been planted. So whether that's the lawn of a farmstead or near a city street, Norway maples, they have a pretty easy time just seeding into our natural areas and growing. And the Norway maples aren't native, so we don't want them in our natural areas, so we'll cut them out of ours. The difference between the Norway and sugar maple can be based on either the leaves or the bark. One of the easiest ways to tell the difference is if you pluck a leaf off of the tree, you can see that the Norway maples have milky sap that'll start coming out of the wound at the end of the petiole. Sugar maples will not have a milky sap. They have a clear, watery sap that's typical of almost all of our native trees. You can also look at the undersides of the leaves. The underside of sugar maple leaves will be kind of whitish in appearance and very soft and fuzzy, like it's covered in a layer of fine velvet. The underside of the Norway maple leaves will be dark green and pretty shiny and smooth, like it's covered in saran wrap. You can also use the bark to tell the difference. Norway maple has a very regular pattern of furrowing on its bark, and it kind of gives it like a neater, tighter appearance. Our sugar maples have pretty irregular and rough bark. And Norway maples, if you're driving around town and you see all of those trees with those dark red, kind of crimson or maroon leaves, every single one of the trees with the dark maple leaves, those are all Norway maples. Okay, let's move on to trees that have opposite branching with pinnately compound leaves. There's two trees around here that fall into that category. One of them is box elder, which you just have to remember that box elders are technically in the maple genus, so it's kind of like a kind of maple, and ash trees. Box elder is generally considered a weedy tree. Like silver maple, its kind of historic range was in floodplains and rivers' edges, but it's really good at expanding into upland habitats like prairies and woodlands. The leaves have 3 to 5 leaflets, which is a pretty small number of leaflets compared to most of our compound leaf trees. Its bark is fairly nondescript. It's just kind of a light grayish color with completely irregular patterns of furrowing. Our ash trees, there are a few different species native to the county, but the most commonly found species around here is green ash. Ash tolerates a wide variety of habitats. I think historically, again, it would have been found in the floodplains, but it's pretty common in our prairies and woodlands as well. Or I should say, at least it was until the emerald ash borer came. The emerald ash borer was and still is a kind of bark boring beetle that will get underneath the bark of the tree and it'll kind of chew off the cambium layer, which in effect girdles the tree. And when they start to die and you peel back the bark, you can usually see it just sort of looks like a really enthusiastic children's scribble underneath that bark. And that will disrupt the vascular tissue of the tree and kill off the entire adult tree. So unfortunately, a great way to tell if there were ash trees there is that now you have a whole section of trees that are starting to die and fall over. The leaves of ash will have about 7-ish leaflets, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. And the bark is pretty distinct. It has this interlacing pattern of its ridges that form kind of this neat, narrow diamond pattern. Now we'll be moving on to alternately branching trees, and we're going to start with the ones that have compound leaves. So 2 trees fall into this category, and they're 2 of our more well-known trees, like our hickories and our walnuts. We have 2 common species of hickories in this region. We have the shagbark that most people are familiar with, and we have the bitternut hickory. And that's different than butternut. That's a kind of walnut that really isn't found around this region. If it does grow around here, it's usually short-lived and it gets a kind of canker that just makes those trees not really do so great around here. So one obvious difference between the shagbark hickory and the bitternut hickory is the bark. Shagbark almost always has that characteristic bark that's pretty shaggy, and you have these big flat plates that start kind of peeling off of the trunk. Bitternut hickory has a completely different bark. It's actually pretty smooth with some very shallow fissures, and it's very, very light in color compared to almost any other tree found around here. It's a lot more white. The leaves of the 2 trees are the same basic shape, pinnately compound leaf with about 7-ish leaflets. And on our hickories, usually the terminal leaflet, the one found on the end, is larger than the rest of the leaflets that are coming off the side of that stalk. Shagbark's leaves are typically significantly larger than the bitternut hickory leaves. Shagbark hickory is usually found in drier woodlands, and it seems to really like to associate with oak trees and grow in the same woods as them. Bitternut hickory seems to like shadier, more moist woodlands, and it doesn't seem to like prescribed burns very much, probably because of that thinner bark. Walnuts are the other kind of tree that falls into this category. Walnuts are commonly found throughout McHenry County. They seem to tolerate a wide variety of habitats, from pretty wet to pretty dry, and they grow in our woods pretty frequently. Their leaves are quite distinct. They're that pinnately compound sort of shape, but they have many, many leaflets on their leaves, sometimes up to 13 or more different leaflets. The bark is pretty distinct. It's a very regular pattern of interlacing ridges, making kind of a nice diamond shape going up the trunk. The leaves of the walnuts, if you can crush them up and smell them, they have this really, really pleasant fragrance. Okay, and now we'll move on to trees with alternate branching and simple leaves. This grouping makes up the bulk of the diversity of trees in our region. So I'm also going to break it up into trees that grow in our woodlands and then trees that grow more in our floodplains and wetter areas. So we'll start with those trees that grow in the woods, and we can start with oak trees, the most characteristic tree of McHenry County. So oaks, they all have pretty obvious leaves. They have that pinnately lobing pattern to them. And there's a bunch of different species in our county, and people mostly break them up into a white oak grouping and a red oak grouping. The white oak grouping, which is made up of trees such as white oak, swamp white oak, or bur oak, they will have these rounded lobes on their edge, very smooth and curvaceous. For the red oak grouping, which covers oaks such as red oak, black oak, scarlet oak, they'll have these pointed tips on the edge of their leaves. So here we have 4 leaves from 4 of the most common oak trees in our county: the bur oak, white oak, red oak, and scarlet oak or pin oak, depending on what you want to call that last one. So the bur oak and white oak leaves both have those rounded edges, and the white oaks tend to have kind of the same size of lobing all throughout the leaves, while the bur oaks tend to have kind of deeply lobed leaves towards the base, and then the top has very shallow lobing. The red oak and scarlet oak leaves are quite similar, except the scarlet oak tends to be kind of like a narrower leaf with more deeply divided lobes. You can also tell from the form of the different trees. So bur oaks like to just really branch out very horizontally, and red oaks kind of are more of like a characteristic forest species that kind of just aim their branches straight up towards the sun. And you can also use the bark as a characteristic too. So bur oak has very, very deeply furrowed bark. White oak kind of has more flattened, lighter colored kind of scales. And red oak has kind of very long, flattened scales running up and down the tree. You can also wait in fall too and identify the oak trees based off of what the acorns look like. Moving on to hackberry. The bark on hackberry is kind of a dead giveaway for that ID. The warty ridges running up and down the bark, that's very characteristic for hackberry. Their leaves are what they call cordate, or kind of heart-shaped, and they have a very asymmetrical base and serrated margins. Another one of our super common trees in the region is black cherry. Again, the bark is a pretty dead giveaway for cherry as well. They have those kind of raised scales, very dark colored. Some people call this like burnt potato chip bark. The leaf is pretty nondescript. It's a simple elliptic leaf with finely serrated margins. The most commonly confused leaf with cherry would be your buckthorn leaf. And cherries kind of have more of that football shaped, and you want to look for that finely serrated margin. Whereas buckthorn leaves tend to be a little bit wider, and they have those very deep veins that sort of curve around the edge of the leaf. They don't go straight out to the edge, they kind of curve up towards the top. Cherries also have a very distinct smell. If you kind of break off one of those younger branches or scratch that thin bark away from the twig with your fingernail and smell it, it needs to be pretty fresh. You can't like bring it into your house and wait an hour. The smell will go away. But it kind of has this odd smell. It's not very pleasant. I think of it kind of like rotten chocolate. And buckthorn will not have that smell. Elms are another kind of tree around here. We don't have so much of the American elm anymore, but we do have quite a bit of red elm or slippery elm, which tends to be a smaller tree than American elm would have been. You can tell mostly from the leaf. It's that elliptic shape with a doubly serrate margin. And I tend to look for the way the leaf feels. It's covered in pretty bristly hairs, which kind of gives it a sandpapery texture to it. Like if you rub your finger on the leaf, you can actually hear it. And the bark is sort of nondescript. It's made up of narrow flat ridges with some shallow furrows. There is a non-native tree around our region, Siberian elm, which I don't have a picture of, but Siberian elms are a very messy, ugly tree with just irregular furrows on its bark, and the leaves are very, very small on Siberian elm compared to our native elms. And there's 3 kind of smaller trees in our region. These are kind of crossing the line. Some people might call these more shrubby. Some people just call them small trees. But we have a lot of hawthorns in the area. And I'm not going to go into the individual species of hawthorn, but hawthorns in general. They're most noticeable from the pretty obvious thorns growing all over the trunk and the small branches. Their leaves are sort of elliptic, but they're very broad at the end, very oval looking, and they're finely serrated right at that terminal end where it's very broad. And the bark is very rough and scaly. Crab apples are also commonly found around here. There are a lot of different cultivars and non-native species of crab apples, but we actually have some native crab apples as well. And it can be very hard to tell the difference, so we're not going to go into that, just how to tell crab apples apart from other trees. So these are the trees that people are most familiar with because they're covered in those beautiful flowers in early spring, ranging anywhere from white to deep, deep pink. The leaves are oval-shaped with some serrations, and they can be shallowly lobed, depending on what kind of species you're looking at. And the bark, like most apple trees, it starts out pretty smooth, and over time it can get a little gray and scaly, but it's always generally quite thin. And finally, the last small tree we're going to cover is called serviceberry, or Juneberry. So this is one of my all-time favorite trees. They make amazing landscape trees. They have beautiful early spring flowers, they're great pollinator plants, and they actually make edible fruits that people can eat too. So these leaves are pretty nondescript as well. They're just generally elliptic to oval shaped with finely serrated margins, and they're actually a lot like cherry. What I look for when telling the difference between cherry and serviceberry is that cherries have kind of very thick leaves, and the leaves on serviceberries are very, very thin. You can also check for that cherry smell, that rotting chocolate smell from the twigs of cherries. Serviceberry doesn't have any kind of smell like that. The bark on serviceberry is just gray and smooth with such shallow fissures that they actually just look like kind of white or brown lines running up and down that bark. And the last tree we're going to cover for our woodlands is the invasive mulberry. It's not as badly invasive as buckthorn or honeysuckle is, but we don't want them in our natural areas, and we will cut them out. A main distinguishing feature of this tree is that they just seem to always have a really messy form. They have odd limbs coming out in weird places, and a lot of the limbs tend to have dead ends or dead pieces of them, which just gives the tree an overall very messy look. Additionally, they do have a milky sap, so if the tree is injured anywhere where the sap flows out and sits on the bark, it kind of stains the bark a dark black, so it has these black streaks over it, which contribute to that overall messy appearance. The bark itself isn't very distinct, the pattern, but if you look in between the furrows or anywhere where the tree is actively growing, like the root collar or young shoots off the twigs, it tends to have this faint orangish color to it, which is a good identifying feature. The leaves itself are pretty good for identification as well. They're simple and serrated, but they have an odd lobing pattern. Even on the same twig, leaves can either be entire or they can have 1 lobes or 2 lobes, and they're all very irregular. Okay, moving on to trees that are found in floodplains, still on the alternate branching and the simple leaves. We'll start with cottonwood. Many people are very familiar with this tree, especially because of the white cotton that just kind of gets everywhere this time of year when the trees are going to seed. The most obvious characteristic of this tree would be the bark. It has this very, very thick, corky bark with deep fissures. Some people actually confuse this for bur oak as well, but the leaves are totally different. The leaves on cottonwood are very triangular in shape. They have a pretty distinct flattened petiole. Petiole just meaning the stem that connects the leaf to the branch. And the edges of those triangular leaves are serrated. In the same genus, we have aspen. They have thin gray bark, but it furrows and gets kind of corky as it gets older. Some people confuse this for paper birch that has very, very white bark that peels off horizontally. The leaves of the aspen are vaguely triangular and they have very, very blunt serrations on them. Basswood is actually a very nice floodplain species. Basswood usually has this multi-stemmed form that's pretty common with our floodplain species. The bark is made up of mostly flat vertical ridges, and one of the chief identifying features of this tree are actually the leaves. The leaves are some of the largest leaves on any of our native trees around here, and they have a distinct heart shape to them. Finally, we'll end with willows, and there are many different species of willows in our region. Some are trees, and most of them are actually shrubs. One of the most common tree species of willows around here are just called black willow. And willows are actually great for habitat. There's a lot of different species of moths and butterflies whose caterpillars rely on willows. It can be very difficult to distinguish different species of willows apart from each other. So instead, we're going to focus on how to tell willows from the rest of the trees. The main feature I look for is its very, very skinny, long leaves. Okay, those are all the trees, so that is it for part 1 of the video. Stay tuned for part 2, the shrubs.